Okay, thank you. Okay. Good evening, everybody. So, agent, structure, endless debate. Wow, what a big question. When I tried to figure out this question, I asked myself to try to focus on something. What form takes this debate in our field of research? That is, of course, here, policy transfer and diffusion. As I will try to explain, and now maybe we can have the first slide. There are only two, so it will not be too complicated. As I will try to explain, first, there are two questions here. I have 10 minutes, so two questions. First, I think this debate leads us to question the assumption that policy transfer can be controlled by its strategic actors, namely policy entrepreneurs. Second, as policy transfers are generally about change, social, political, administrative change, it leads us to question the motivations of the different type of actors involved in it, or more precisely, the dynamics of social action. So let me discuss a little bit these two questions. First, so do entrepreneurs control the policy transfer process? In a classical rational choice theory approach, individuals do have the relevant information to do the rational decisions, to make rational decisions, and they do have the knowledge of the consequences of their decision and actions. Yes, okay, but the problem is that numerous field studies about reforms and about policy transfers have shown that the contrary is true. I refer here to all the literature about the unintended consequences of policy transfers. And here, the important thing maybe is to distinguish between actors' action on the one hand and its consequences on the other hand. According to the German sociologist Norbert Elias, this is linked to an apparently very simple fact. This simple fact is the following. Individuals don't act in isolation. They are not, as he says, homo clausus, in themselves. I refer here to the concept of configuration in Elias' terms, which gives the possibilities to think the unintended consequences of individuals' initiatives and calculation. Individuals in particular don't control what happens when their decisions meet the ones of other individuals linked with them in small or larger configurations. The second question now, the motivation of the actors involved in the transfer. Once again, in a traditional rational choice approach, this question is meaningless. Actors try to maximize their benefits in a given strategic situation. We all know the game theory. I don't have to go on. Okay. This is a more complicated question, I think, than the first one. Because on the one hand, it is difficult not to consider that human being is endowed with reason, at least after the philosophy of the 17th century, especially in France, Descartes. Okay. In the sense that the individuals always give a certain logic to their action and decisions. Okay, but immediately we have to add that rationality is relative. If one accepts a social model or cultural model in which benefiting oneself is optimal, then it is of course rational to behave in a selfish way. Whereas, if one accepts a model in which benefiting the group is optimal, then purely selfish behavior is deemed irrational. For policy transfer studies, the problem, in my point of view, lies in the assumption of the uniformity of human rationality. I think we can consider this assumption as an illusion, a philosophical illusion, actually. Because can we really consider that all individuals in the world view their interest in the same way? We can consider, on the contrary, that rational calculus in itself is limited by a range of options, the range of options which is available in a given moment of history, in a given society. This does not mean that the individual does not have a real room of maneuver, of freedom if you prefer, but that the range of options is not unlimited, and that it is framed by cultural and social factors. That is why in our introduction to the book Public Policy Transfer, with Leslie Powell and Chris Walker, we propose to analyze international transfers as intersocial mobilities, the way actors interpret and use or not the object of transfer depends on the social space in which they are embedded, in which they work, in which they live. It can also depend, actually, on the representation, social representation they have of the sender, let's say, whether it is an international organization or a national government or an NGO. In sum, to analyze what is really going on during a transfer, we need to reintroduce the social and historical dimensions associated with the object of the transfer, and also, maybe, associated with the learning process from abroad in itself. Take, for example, take for an illustration the example of the Eastern and Central European countries. As we all know, during the Eastern enlargement of the European Union, most of policy promoters from West to East took for granted that Central and Eastern European populations subscribe to the Western model of a liberal state and of a liberal society. And they presented the instruments or the institutions transferred as being only technical or organizational. And I think that the neutralization of the political and social meaning of the changes which occurred during the accession process is a phenomenon which needs to be more deeply analyzed. In my sense, this contradiction between the political meaning, the political nature of the decision made during the 90s and their technocratic presentation is one of the grounds on which the contemporary political closure of Hungary and Poland could grow. Because here, let me remind that the Eurosceptic rhetoric takes a societal form, saying our societies, Eastern society, does not want to look like yours. So now the second and last slide. How much time do I have, Diane? 3 minutes? Yeah, thank you. So now, to finish, let me say that there is here a challenge, maybe a stimulating one, I hope so, how to introduce the social meaning of institutions without reintroducing social structuralism. How to bring into the picture history or historicity without reintroducing historical determinism. Of course, I don't have a magic answer. But instead, a series of reflections based on the rediscovery of some old-fashioned, I must say, old-fashioned authors and texts. Because one of the direction of thought I had these few years, in these few years, is to rediscover comparative social history, which was mainly dedicated to the state and its genesis, its evolution. But I think we can take some methodological and epistemological feature of this approach for our more micro research. The authors who helped me the most in this direction are not specialists of Europe, but interestingly enough, I think especially here where we have a lot of specialists of the South, they are specialists of post-colonial or post-empire countries. I think here of the French Africanist Jean-François Bayard, and I think also of the American specialist of state-society relations in post-colonial states, Joe Migdal. Both have in common something which is very interesting, I think, to try to take into account the social dimension of institution, here mainly the state in itself, without freezing their research in a deterministic and static presentation. In 2 words only, because I don't have time to continue on, to go on, but the concept, for example, of trajectoire politique, political trajectories, developed by Jean-François Bayard, is interesting because it differs from the one of past dependence. We all know neo-institutionalism, to which it may be compared because it takes more systematically into account external influences and forces. It refers to the intertwining of large-scale regional or global forces, on the one hand, with distinctive local ones on the other. Once again, in 2 words, Joel Migdal criticizing the modeling of the state, what he calls the golden standard of the state, which is, of course, created after the Western historical trajectory of the state. And according to which most of the real states, existing states in the world, are not states at all. There are no state or fragile state or, okay. Instead, Migdal tries to capture the 2-sided peculiarity of the state, recognizing states' isomorphism. At the one hand, all states have some common feature nowadays, as a flag, a capital, a seat in the UN, etc. And the diversity of what real states actually practice in their administration, in their ties with the population, with the relationship to other states and transnational actors. So to really finish now, what would mean rediscovering the historical and cultural meaning of institutions in policy transfer studies? This means to give more importance to local actors and context, to try to figure how given political transfer reshapes political or professional coalitions, how it is viewed and interpreted at the local level, etc. This means maybe to collaborate more with sociologists and anthropologists specialized in the study of the societies concerned by the transfers. And I have the feeling that the policy transfer conferences are the right place to innovate in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, so about the same question, thank you very much, Diane. And I think, yes, there is a risk, and this risk is a risk of this introducing a bias, you say like bias, by insisting all the time and looking only at policy transfers or at things that can be compared to policy transfers. Yes, so this risk exists, especially if we over-specialize ourselves. So the risk of over-segmentation of the social sciences, of course, this is, I think, well-known and obvious. So, I don't know, in 2 words, one of the solutions, I think, is to first to be aware of that, and thank you for your question, And second, to try to cooperate with other specialists of other policy research fields, even with specialists of other social sciences working on the same field, same terrain. And I think that once again, this type of format, this conference, multidisciplinary, helps not to forget plurifactorial and complex plurifactorial nature of social dynamics. Thank you.